We are back in the car graveyard for another episode of Junkyard Storytime. And today we have some background noise and background music, so my apologies for that. But we also have this American-Italian mashup. The Chrysler TC by Maserati with a hardtop. Let's go ahead and dive right in. So let's go back to 1979. Chrysler is almost bankrupt. Two things ultimately helped them stay afloat: a fat pile of government bailout money and the Chrysler K-car platform. So these K-cars, they were a totally different clean sheet design from Chrysler. They're front-wheel drive, they're a small platform, and this is a big change. I mean, think of the huge 1970s cars that came before that, early 80s and all that stuff. You have long hoods, you have long trunks, they're heavy, and they're mostly rear-wheel drive. But the American car companies at this time were trying to pivot away from those styles of cars and start selling things that were front-wheel drive, which usually had the engines turned sideways, which they call transverse mounted, and this is what the K-car did for Chrysler. So they actually took this platform, and they had a few different variations on the K-car platform that had their own designations, and they spawned literally dozens of cars just from that one design. And one of the things that was one of the biggest new models that came out of that platform was the Dodge Caravan, which of course totally changed the car industry in the 80s. So Lee Iacocca was the CEO of Chrysler at that time. He gets the credit for basically saving Chrysler using the K-car platform and all those derivatives. You fast forward a few years to the mid-80s, Chrysler's doing a whole lot better, and Iacocca decides to start thinking outside the box, and he decides he wants to build a fancy pants luxury convertible. So this is the car that would be named the TC by Maserati. So it was born out of the friendship between Iacocca and the Maserati boss, Alejandro de Tomaso. I mean, they were friends for over 20 years by that time, so they made a deal. Chrysler needed cachet, and Maserati just needed cash. So Chrysler agreed to pay Maserati to build the TC in Italy. The plan was to basically take the LeBaron convertible Caterpillar and turn it into a luxury convertible butterfly. So one of the cars that used the derivative of the K-car platform was the aforementioned LeBaron convertible. It was a very successful car. It was doing very well, but it was relatively plain. So they wanted to take a similar platform that the LeBaron was based on and turn it into the TC. They decided to convert the four-seater LeBaron style into the TC that only had two seats, and they were hoping they could compete with the other luxury drop tops on the market. The main competitor was probably the Mercedes SL two-seaters. Basically, we're talking 1980s, so they were the king of the segment. They had great sales, and they had very high quality and very high reputation, so they would have been the target. So originally, they planned to release the TC before the redesigned third-gen LeBaron. They were trying to release the TC as early as 1986 or 87, but production of the TC was delayed by over 2 years, and the redesigned LeBaron actually came out before the TC. Whoops. Now, one thing I do want to mention is there was another American car that ended up becoming a rival to the TC, and that was the Cadillac Allante. So Cadillac came out with their car first in 1987. This was a convertible as well. It had a new V8. It was front-wheel drive, and it only had two seats. Interestingly enough, just like the TC, the Allante was also the product of an alliance with Italy. Basically, GM had the exterior bodies for the Allante cars designed by the famous coach builder Pininfarina. They produced the bodies in Italy. They flew them to Detroit, and then GM combined the bodies with the Cadillac chassis and drivetrain to basically finish the car. If you're thinking that sounds expensive, you would be right. Now, Cadillac could get away with selling cars at a high price. Chrysler couldn't really so much, so Cadillac was able to still attempt at reasonably making money, even though they had this absurd production process in place to have the bodies flown in from Italy. They did actually make the Allante for 7 model years, but a lot of people consider it sort of a failed experiment, and after the Allante stopped production, they did not redesign it or anything like that. The TC by Maserati finally comes out as a 1989 model, and it totally bombed. I mean, nobody bought these cars. One of the major reasons was just the price. I mean, just to give you a comparison to the LeBaron that it was kind of sort of based on, the most expensive trim level of the LeBaron started around $20,000. Now, there were cheaper LeBarons that were in the 14, 15, 16,000 range, but the top LeBaron was $20K. The TC by Maserati started at $33,000. Now, you could adjust that for inflation. I'm pretty sure that's somewhere in the ballpark of $70,000 today, but back then, it was a ton of money. In 1990, they raised the price to $35,000, and then in 91, they raised the price to $37,000. The engine that they started with in the TC by Maserati was the Chrysler 2.2 Turbo. Now, this wasn't particularly exotic. Chrysler had used this in lots of other cars. Many of their products, even some of the Dodge Caravans, I think, had the 2.2 Turbo. But it was prolific. They used it in a lot of different vehicles, and so for it to be used in this new TC kind of made sense. Unfortunately, they only had one transmission option with that engine, and it was a 3-speed automatic. Womp womp. Now, I do want to mention there was a more advanced version of the 2.2 Turbo, which had a cross-flow Cosworth cylinder head. It was a twin cam, and it made 200 horsepower, and it came with a 5-speed manual transmission. But they only sold a few hundred of these, so I'll probably never see one in my life, and they're really rare and not the combination that the car was sold with the most. So the 2.2 Turbo, the simple one, the single overhead cam, was only sold for 1 year. Then in 1990, they switched to a 3-liter V6. I don't think I mentioned this yet, but the letters TC originally stood for turbo convertible. And now in 1990, it's no longer a turbo. Whoops. I thought it was funny that when the car was launched, Automobile magazine joked that the letters TC actually stood for too costly. Amazing. Now, the hardtop on these cars was a standard option, which was kind of a surprise to me to learn. It basically looks like every other painted metal hardtop you see out there, but it's plastic. So it doesn't weigh very much, but it's not a substantial hardtop. All the TCs also had a folding soft top that stows away under the hardtop when you fit it. And as you can see, this car in the junkyard actually has the hardtop in place. Unlike the Cadillac Allante, which had its final assembly completed in America, the TC was produced entirely in Italy. Now, lots of the mechanical components were provided by European suppliers, and some of the components were supplied by Chrysler. But basically, this whole car was assembled and produced in Europe, but with an American recipe. It's basically like eating at McDonald's in Brussels and thinking you're having European cuisine and paying a lot more money for it. The constant joke with these cars is that everybody thinks it's a LeBaron. Even today, if you see one of these at Cars and Coffee, people will probably call it a LeBaron. It just doesn't look different enough to prevent people from making that association. And the problem for Chrysler was, why would somebody want to pay a ton more money for a luxury car that's not that different from the humble car that it's based on? It just doesn't add up. It's amazing that Chrysler made that mistake because there was a really similar flop that happened a few years early with the Cadillac Cimarron. Now, that car was just a tarted up Chevy Cavalier in a tuxedo, and the public wasn't fooled, and nobody bought that car either. And it was such a failure that people actually hold up the Cimarron today as the prototype of badge engineering done very poorly. Now back to the TC. So Chrysler took a page from the Cimarron by naming their car the TC by Maserati, because the Cadillac Cimarron was officially referred to as the Cimarron by Cadillac. So people just saw the TC by Maserati as a plain car that's cosplaying as a big shot, and they were hoping people would take the bait, and they just didn't. The TC is the car equivalent of paying to self-publish your book, so you can tell people at parties that you're a published author. The TC is like transferring a microwave TV dinner onto a plate in the hopes that your date will think that you know how to cook. So let's talk about some production numbers. So they made a total of 7,300 cars across 3 production years, which was way below the target sales numbers for the TC. Incidentally, 7,300 was also the minimum production number that Chrysler was contractually obligated to buy from Maserati. So they only built as many cars as they had to, and then they shut it down. The wild thing is that Iacocca went on the record many times basically saying that he expected this car was going to be a classic roadster someday. Oof. To add to the fact that the TC didn't sell well, it also cost a fortune to make. Go figure, the whole thing was made in Europe by Maserati. They lost a ton of money on this program. Now, fun fact, Chrysler and Maserati are owned by the same parent company, Stellantis. That was a merger between the Fiat Chrysler Group and the French PSA Group. So, TC by Maserati was basically a high school fling that ended badly. And then 25 years later, when neither one of them was married, after a series of failed relationships, Chrysler and Maserati decided they might as well get hitched. That's not the most historically accurate summary of what happened, but it's the one I'm going with. Now, before we wrap up this video, I want to leave you with a little bit of automotive ASMR so you can experience the sights and sounds of this Chrysler TC by Maserati. Thanks again for watching. Cheers.